Today I'm going to be showing you guys a nearly perfected version of what is in my opinion the most versatile build in the entire game. This build can not only do literally up to 10 to 15 million damage per second on just bosses. As you can see, if I slow this down here, it's doing over 1 million damage per hit, and Tornado has a massive amount of hits happening per second, so you can just absolutely nuke bosses. But you can actually get this damage up to around 3 million per Tornado hit while just running around in Nightmare Dungeons, so not only is it one of the highest damaging builds in the entire game, you also have literally movement speed cap 24/7. You're running around at 200% movement speed permanently, and you're just one-tapping everything in your way. You don't even have to look at the mobs while you're running around, and you also have infinite evade charges with the boots that we're using. So you're just speed farming faster than almost any other build in the entire game. And not to mention, this build has an unbelievable amount of survivability because you are playing on a Druid. You literally have permanent unstoppable, you can't ever get crowd controlled, and you just have a crazy amount of defensive stats. Pretty much regardless of the content that you're doing, this build is one of the best builds in the entire game. As you can see, the build is pretty insane, and I'm excited to show you guys a pretty much perfected version of it. Before I get into the video, I want to give a big thanks to today's sponsor, Z-League. Z-League is a gaming app that's available for free on both iOS and Android that is perfect for helping you guys find teammates, track your own in-game stats, and even share some of your guys' best Diablo moments. As you guys may know, the absolute best way to level up in Diablo 4 is actually doing Nightmare Dungeons in a group, and unfortunately there just isn't an LFG feature actually built into Diablo 4, and it can be very hard to find people to play with, and that's where Z-League actually comes in perfectly clutch. They have their own LFG feature, which allows you to filter people based on interest, based on region, based on if they have a mic, based on activities that you guys want to do, and much more, so you can actually very easily find the perfect person to go and grind with. Not only that, you can actually even earn coins on Z-League just by playing the game and playing with other people, and you can actually use these coins to not only enhance your own profile, but even get scuff controllers, gaming keyboards, and a bunch of other free stuff. And if you download using my link in the description, you'll get a free 500 coins to go towards your next controller or something. And if you happen to leave a comment on my post saying buff Druid, I will select 6 lucky winners to get a free Lilith carry, so you guys can get this sick mount while also getting the title Lilith's Doom absolutely for free. So don't forget to follow my profile, and again, download for free using the link in the description, and I'll see you guys in the Z-League app. Alright, let's just get into things. Obviously, this build does require the Tempest Roar helmet, and I'm very sorry for my Druid friends out there that do not have this. I'd recommend watching my previous video where I mentioned talking about how you can actually farm for uniques. Recently, Blizzard unfortunately made a hotfix where you can no longer target farm, so the best change that they've made in weeks lasted for about, I don't know, 12 hours or something. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but watch the video and you should be able to get a Tempest Roar within like a couple days of farming. Unfortunately, you do need this for the build to even function at all. Basically, what this does and how the build works is we need our Storm skills to work as Werewolf skills so that we can use Grizzly Rage. We use this with the Dire Wolf aspect, so the Grizzly Rage now turns us into a Werewolf as opposed to a Werebear. The reason that we care about being a Werewolf is because it reduces our Spirit cost reduction by 75%, and Tornado is a very expensive skill, costing 44 Spirit cost right now based on my sheet. So getting 75% reduction on this basically enables us to spam it in the first place. And then you pair this with the Rampaging Werebeast aspect, which gives us up to 1000% critical strike damage while we are in Grizzly Rage, anytime that we're just getting crits. And we're going to be getting crits constantly because we're pairing this with Earthen Might, so that we constantly get a guaranteed critical strike chance proc pretty much. And because Tornado has so many instances of damage happening simultaneously, you actually have pretty good uptime on this, even though the lucky hit chance is rather low. That is the crux of the build. The whole point is basically to stay in Grizzly Rage all the time for max movement speed, for guaranteed fortified generation all the time, and for 75% spirit cost reduction, and for 1000% critical strike damage when we get totally stacked up. Pair this with our boons, where Calamity extends the duration of our ultimate skill by 25%. We get cooldown reduction on our ultimate skill just by getting lucky hits, and we want lucky hit anyways because of our Earthen Might. And then you also get literally infinite healing with Masochistic, because anytime you get a crit, which is all the time and constantly, there's no internal cooldown on this, you just instantly full heal all the time. And also we get additional attack speed. Unfortunately, the Avian Wrath multiplier here isn't a multiplier, it's just additive critical strike damage, which is really bad. Haven't thoroughly tested this, so feel free to test it on your own. But from what I've seen, at least on tooltip in the sheet, this is just 30% additive crit damage, which is not good, so you'd rather just go for the attack speed. Now that we understand the basis of the build, let's go over the skills. Again, the entirety of the build will be posted over on the website, so feel free to check that out. As you can see, I have a lot of these other skills unlocked. Don't worry about it, it's just because of my chest piece, which we'll talk about when we get into the gear. When it comes to our basic skill, I like to use Storm Strike because it has a decent lucky hit chance, so we have a good amount of chance to proc our Earthen Might if we ever get into a scenario where we have no spirit. I'll have a spirit section of the video later on. Sorry, this will be a little bit of a detailed video, but I'll have a spirit section dedicated to just talking about how you can maintain high spirit. Storm Strike is pretty good for proccing Earthen Might, but also I mainly use it for the 25% damage reduction after using it. So if you're doing like a Lightning Storm dungeon or something, Lightning Storm is about to pop, don't even bother going in the bubble, dude. You're a Giga Chad Druid. You just smack a guy in the face and then boom, 25% DR. Obviously, we're going to be using Tornado here, and Tornado has an inherent chance to imply vulnerable, so that is very nice for just having vulnerable uptime. And Tornado is the better choice for this build. You could alternatively try Lightning Storm, but Tornado simply just does more damage because it has multiple instances of the damage happening, and it automatically seeks enemies, which makes it perfect for speed clearing. You don't even have to look at the enemies that you're fighting. You walk into a room, throw tornadoes out while you're running by, and everything will just get melted behind you. When it comes to our other skills, Blood Howl is good for just a permanent 15% attack speed pretty much all the time. And Hurricane is fantastic for one of our legendaries, but also it will guarantee slow enemies. It constantly is doing ticking damage, so it does have a chance to apply lucky hits via and proc your Earthen Might and stuff like that, but it also makes enemies deal 20% less damage. Ultimately, Hurricane is fantastic, and then of course we have Grizzly Rage for all the reasons that I mentioned. Permanent Unstoppable, Fortify, gives us 1000% crit damage, 75% spirit cost reduction, 38 movement speed. I don't even know what else to say. Yeah, Grizzly Rage is pretty broken. When it comes to our last skill, previously I was using, what was I even using? I think I was using like Trample or something. It doesn't matter. For your last skill, if you're doing like harder dungeons, you want Cyclone Armor because it just gives you non-physical damage reduction all the time, which is helpful. But for speed farming, I like to Trample just to have a little bit of movement when I wasn't in my ult and I was just waiting to get to enemies. Alternatively, you could do like Earthen Bulwark or something for a little bit of extra Fortify / having another Unstoppable when you're actually out of your Grizzly Rage. Doesn't really matter. You can do whatever you want with the last skill. When it comes to the skill tree, unfortunately, the Druid skill tree is a little cut and dry with this build. You just want to go for Storm Strike and get the Storm Strike chain. This is a little unnecessary, but I go for it just for the additional lucky hit chances, just so that it may proc Earthen Might if I'm ever in a very sticky situation. Alternatively, you can just swap this to Fierce for the vulnerable application, but because Tornado has the vulnerable application chance, you're going to be proccing vulnerable quite often. Max out the Tornado, and then we're going to get some points into Wild Impulses just so we do extra damage. If you're having spirit problems, you could take the point out here, but it's not really all that big of a deal. And then I have 3 into Predatory Instinct for 6% crit chance, and then some movement speed with Digitigrade Gate. And who made this name? What does that even mean? This makes it very easy to get the movement speed cap on this build, and you only need movement speed on a couple pieces of gear, which I'll show you guys. When it comes to Cyclone Armor, you just go for Preserving so that you get a little bit of damage reduction here. I mean, 30% damage reduction every once in a while is quite nice, and of course, we're using this for the non-fizz damage reduction that's active all the time. Actually, pressing the ability basically doesn't really do anything. It just knocks enemies back. If you want to knock back every once in a while, whatever. Vigilance is nice because anytime that we pop either our Blood Howl or our Cyclone Armor, that's 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds. So you want to make sure to be popping Blood Howl at least every 6 seconds. It's also going to heal you instantly, and it's going to give you 15% movement speed, attack speed all the time. So Blood Howl is pretty insane for the build. And then we have 3 points into Nature's Reach just for a little bit of extra damage. And then here is where I deviate a little bit from others. I like to go 3 into Elemental Exposure just for a little more uptime on Vulnerable. Honestly, you don't really need it, but the main thing that I do is I like 3 points into Endless Tempest to just make Hurricane last longer, because whenever Hurricane's up, we get an extra 2 ranks to our Tornado, which is fantastic, but we also get 20%, or enemies deal 20% less damage to us, which is great. But Hurricane also is going to constantly be dealing damage, so it has a chance to proc our Earthen Might, which is very nice just for overall consistency with the build. And it does instantly proc slow, as opposed to having to apply poison and then proc the slow. So then we have Neurotoxin, so poisoned enemies are slowed, and we pretty much always poison enemies because anytime we get a crit with a werewolf skill, which our Tornado does count as a werewolf skill now, it's going to apply poison, so poison is then going to apply slow, and then because enemies are poisoned, they're going to take 60% critical strike damage. This is not additive crit damage, this is multiplicative, so this is literally just 60% damage if you have ranks 2 and Venom on your Amulet, which you 100% want. Absolutely cracked passive here, and we're pretty much always critting with our Earthen Might, so that is just a ridiculous amount of extra damage for us. then 3 into Defiance for damage, Circle of Life is whatever, 3 into Resonance for just extra damage. It's only 6%, so if you wanted more survivability, you could take the 3 out of there, the 1 out of there, and you could go into Fortify Generation, and then Nature's Resolve for even more Fortify. If I was doing higher dungeons, I would definitely make this swap because it's not too much damage that I'm getting here, and the additional Fortify Generation would feel quite nice. And then I have Grizzly Rage here. Our main Fortify, or pretty much our only Fortify, is from Grizzly Rage. You get 8% Fortify, but it's only of your base HP every second. So scaling your Fortify Generation, which you can actually do pretty well on gear and stuff, is quite nice. And then, of course, we have Earth and Might. Earth and Might is unbelievably insane. We want to scale our lucky hit so we have a chance to proc this more often, but it basically gives us a full Spirit Restore, and it causes all of our attacks for the next 5 seconds to be guaranteed crits. And then while it's active, you can re-proc it so that you can get the guaranteed crit just chaining over and over again. And if you have more crit chance, then you have a higher chance of procking this up from 5 to 10. When it comes to the legendaries and the stats that you want on your gear, I'm going to go a little in depth with the crit damage stuff, but again, everything will be posted over on the website if you want an easy way to reference the skill tree, skill points, and the priority list in which you want stats on your gear, etc. When it comes to legendaries, the single most important thing that you want is the Direwolf chain, and you want this as a high of a roll as humanly possible to slap onto an amulet. The reason for this is the 75% spirit cost reduction is monumentally important. Spirit cost reduction, or any reduction in this game, is not actually going to be additive. So basically what's going to happen is if my tornado costs 44, what's going to happen is that's going to be calculated by the 75% first, and then any other spirit cost reduction is going to be calculated afterward on the value that is after the 75% reduction. So basically what this means is getting any reduction after the 75% is very minimal, but getting the 75% or as high as humanly possible on this roll is the single most important thing you can do. Basically, my spirit cost from Tornado will go all the way down to like 11, and then any more spirit cost reduction will just be calculated off of that 11 number. So if I get 10% reduction on 11, that's only 1, as opposed to 10% reduction on 44, which would be 4. Hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Basically, though, spirit cost reduction is not all that important, but getting the maxed out Direwolf aspect is incredibly important to make your Tornado way less costly. And it's also nice to just zoom around the map, so that is hugely important. The next most important thing is just getting the Rampaging Werebeast. Getting a good roll in this literally doesn't matter. You're just using this for the crit damage scaling, which will likely get nerfed in the future because you get 1000% extra crit damage, which is insane. Next, you want the Accelerating aspect for 25% increased attack speed literally all the time, which just means the animation on Tornado is faster and you can just spam them out way more frequently. Next, you pretty much need the Earthen Might key passive also applies to your storm skills. The build does not work without this because you need Earthen Might to work. You could take this off if you don't want to use Earthen Might, but if you're not using Earthen Might, in my opinion, you are trolling. So definitely want to get that. And then we have, while Hurricane is active, you gain 2 ranks to your shapeshifting skills. This is nice because our Tornado turns into a shapeshifting skill, so anytime we pop this, we basically have an extra 2 ranks to our Tornado, so we just deal a whole bunch of extra damage. Alternatively, you can use, while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies. You don't actually need this for the movement speed because you are movement speed capped up to 200% without this aspect. This is mainly just for the quality of life of being able to move through enemies, which I do find quite nice. And if you don't have a lot of the movement speed on your other pieces of gear, which we'll talk about in a bit, and max rolls, then you won't have, movement speed cap. Then you want Tornado seeks up to 3 targets. This is very hard to get. Having it at least 1 is perfectly fine though, don't worry too much about it. And then Retaliation is crazy, 40% damage while fortified, if you're like max fortified, which we want to be, which a lot of the time we are, but even if we're not permanently fortified, this is still a lot of extra damage for us. So that is good. And then on the pants, you want Disobedience, or chest Disobedience, right, for the extra armor. And then for the helmet, obviously we want Tempest Roar. And then for the chest, I finally got it. A lot of people have been asking about this. Mad Wolf's Glee is fantastic for speed farming and doing easier stuff. If you're doing higher tier dungeons, Mad Wolf's Glee isn't great because you're losing out on a lot of damage reduction. So basically, I have 2 pairs of chests with this build. I have my Mad Wolf's Glee, which gives you actually 3 ranks to your werewolf skills, and our Tornado is a werewolf skill, so as you can see, my Tornado is at a rank 12, which makes it go from 9 to 12, so from 63% base damage all the way up to 74%, which is a crazy increase there. That gives us a ton of damage. So we also get the movement speed from the Mad Wolf's Glee, which means you can very easily hit movement speed cap without having the legendary on our boots. So I can also get the Hurricane active. So basically I get 5 ranks of Tornado. So this is basically better than having a Shaco because I get 5 ranks as opposed to 4. You also retain some damage reduction on the chest, which is still quite nice, but if you're doing higher tier dungeons, you definitely want to swap to a chest like the one I have here with like, you know, a lot of damage reduction oriented stuff and also a damage reduction legendary while you are shapeshifted. Mad Wolf's Glee is not mandatory in any way, shape, or form, but it does just give you a nice bit of extra damage, and I finally looted it yesterday. When it comes to stats on your gear, obviously Tempest Roar is what it is, and then for the chest, like I was just mentioning, damage reduction while fortified is great, damage reduction, total armor, and then damage reduction from close or distant is your best bet. On the gloves, you want attack speed, ranks of Tornado, crit chance. Crit chance is still important because crit chance basically works as a safety net so that because Earthen Might procs on lucky hit, right, but it has a 10% chance if you crit, and also you don't always have this proc, so having the crit chance is nice. And then we also go for lucky hit chance, so we have just a higher base lucky hit on our Tornado. You can actually get it up to 12% total lucky hit if you had max rolls on everything, which is just good for overall consistency with the build. You could go for like crit damage or storm skill cooldown reduction, but I think that the lucky hit and the crit chance is just better for consistency with the build. The pants, you pretty much want the same thing as the chest. Damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, damage reduction while you're fortified, damage reduction from close. You can get a crazy amount of DR with this build. When it comes to the boots, I pretty much have 2 different pairs of boots here. The most important thing I would say is getting movement speed, and then next to that is getting as high of a roll of total armor in werewolf form as you can so that you're constantly at armor cap. Outside of that, getting willpower is nice for extra damage, but also I would actually recommend, as opposed to all this other stuff on here, I would recommend getting fortified generation. The spirit cost reduction is not all that big of a deal. If I put the 6.9% there, my Tornado goes from 11 spirit cost down to 10. I don't really care about that. I'd way rather have 30% spirit or fortify generation, so I have higher uptime on my fortify, not only for survivability but also for damage with one of our glyphs. You could also opt for damage reduction while injured instead of the willpower and get fortify generation, so you have a lot of survivability via your boots there. And then you can do either the Hurricane giving you the 2 ranks, or you can go for, you know, the unstoppable movement speed thing. When it comes to the weapon, let's have a little bit of a tangent about crit damage. So you can have crit damage on your weapon and on your rings and on your gloves. A lot of people make the argument that crit damage does nothing because you get 1000% extra crit damage when you are fully ramped up, which is true. When you're fully ramped up, the crit damage is additive, so getting the crit damage like 30% on your weapon is pretty insignificant when you have 1000% total. However, you are not always instantly ramped up. So I don't think crit damage has 0 value, but I don't think it has all that much value. The problem is if you take the crit damage off, the only other thing that you're going to get is some additive damage like core skill or damage to poison. So it's not the end of the world if you have crit damage on a weapon or a ring, but it's also not the best thing to have. But also the additive damage isn't a big deal anyway. So it's hard to tell what exactly is perfect because I care a lot about consistency, and having the crit damage for when you're not in your Grizzly Rage or for when you're not ramped up, I do think is nice to have. Anyways, at a bare minimum on your weapon, you want to have an axe because it has higher attack speed and it does damage to healthy, and you want at a minimum willpower and vulnerable damage. Those are the 2 most important. Outside of that, you could go for core skill, damage to crowd controlled, damage to slowed, or crit damage. When it comes to the scrotum totem here, you can get multiple things. I like to have cooldown reduction and lucky hit chance. I think those are the 2 most important. You can go for a lot of other stuff. Instead of this lucky hit chance to restore, which I don't really think is all that good anyways, you can get like crit chance for just overall more consistency. You can get damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned or damage reduction while fortified. Again, spirit cost reduction I think is redundant, so don't worry too much about it. Cooldown reduction and lucky hit is the 2 most important things though. When it comes to the rings, you pretty much just want this ring here: vulnerable damage, crit chance, lucky hit chance, and damage to slowed or crit damage. Both of these are pretty good. I like to have the lucky hit here, and as you can see, my Tornado is at 11%, but if I had a higher rolled gloves, I'm pretty sure this would go up to 12%. When it comes to the amulet, this is literally perfect. You want ranks 2 in Venom, damage reduction, and then movement speed. The movement speed is very nice, but if you're playing the movement speed boots, you could forego the movement speed on the amulet and actually go for more damage reduction in the form of total armor or damage reduction from close enemies. And then the cooldown reduction is massively important. At the very least, make sure to get in Venom and the cooldown reduction. Let's quickly go over the Paragon board. This Paragon board I actually pretty much just copied from somebody, shout out Tio, but I did end up changing some of the points and how you allocate it. Definitely make sure to just check it out over on the website. Not going to go too in depth with this because, you know, it's just over on the website, so you can just copy and paste it. Quickly, I'll talk about a few things though. One thing you want to mention, or one thing that I want to mention, is that when you're leveling up, you don't want to put werewolf in here first. You actually want to slap in exploit first in your first board. That's the most important thing, is just slapping an exploit. And then you immediately want your second board to actually be Lust for Carnage. I'll have a leveling guide over on the website, so make sure to check that out. But when you're leveling, Lust for Carnage is pretty much your main source of getting spirit back, because it's anytime you get a crit, 2 spirit back. And with Earthen Might, guess what? We have guaranteed crits. Guess what? Our tornado does 10 instances of damage a second. Guess what? That's 20 spirit a second, basically, you know? Crazy amount of damage there, or sorry, spirit generation there. And then I slap in Undaunted here for the extra damage while fortified. Your fortify uptime is not permanent, so you don't always have the damage here, but there isn't really a good alternative, because I'm not a big fan of damage to close, because a lot of our damage is to distant enemies, and Fang and Claw is okay. So I don't know, up to you. Personally though, when you do have fortified up, 107% additive is a lot of damage, and also the damage reduction here is quite nice. And then you just put a little bit of points into Heightened Malice for a 1.45, which is insane. Anytime that there's 3 or more enemies poisoned, and you're pretty much always poisoning enemies. Ancestral Guidance is fantastic for just extra damage. And then I also go for Spirits for the extra crit, and then it makes enemies take a little bit more damage. Because we're getting 1000% crit damage, this is not super insane getting the crit here, but I still think it is nice. And then Thunderstruck is a fantastic board, just deal 30% increased crit damage against vulnerable enemies, which is all the time, because our Tornado skill is a Storm skill. I did take a few points out of the crit damage here so that I could reallocate them a little bit more to get a tiny bit more additive damage. And then I go for Earth and Sky just for the extra damage here, and it also buffs the damage reduction from Vulnerable, which is fantastic. You get another 8% DR there. That's pretty good. And then in this board, we just go for Exploits for the extra vulnerable damage. Again, check out the leveling version of this build over on the website, and the full version of this will also be over there if you're level 100. If you're having spirit problems, unfortunately there is not really all that much you can do other than get a maxed out Direwolf chain, because a 75% reduction is very, very good for you. But also, getting more lucky hit on your gear is hugely impactful for your overall consistency with the build, because that means you'll be proccing Earthen Might more, and when you proc Earthen Might, you're going to have guaranteed crits. So basically this build relies heavily on having Earthen Might procced, but also having good density, because the more mobs there are, the easier it is to proc Earthen Might, the easier it is to land all of your crits, and the more crits that you're landing, the more that you're actually proccing Lust for Carnage, which is pretty much the crux of all of your spirit generation. You also get spirit on kill from your Paragon board as well, so that's pretty much the main stuff you care about when it comes to actually having spirit. You could alternatively, as opposed to accelerating aspect, try out an Umbral Ring. An Umbral Ring, if you have a 4 roll, will give you 4 pretty much every time you hit an enemy, because you are applying slow. And you actually apply slow twice, because Hurricane has its own slow percentage, which is 25%, and then Neurotoxin is its own slow percentage of 8%. So if you just walk into enemies and you have a Umbral active, you'll pretty much instantly proc 8 spirit all the time, which is more than enough, because a Tornado literally costs only 11 when you actually go into your Grizzly Rage. Again, spirit cost reduction on your gear is really not going to help you. You only really care about getting the max roll of Direwolf, and also just getting a lot of lucky hit on your gear to have more uptime on Earthen Might. Now I'll just show you guys some gameplay. This is only a 58 because it's the only blind burrows I could get. Like I was saying though, mob density is very important for this build. If you're just doing dungeons where there's wraiths and they're all super spread out, there's not really much you can do. Obviously, you know, you can still do the dungeon perfectly fine, but the build is going to function significantly better in dungeons that has way more density. I wanted to do a dungeon that was a little bit higher than this, but this is the only high-ish blind burrows I could find. But I'll kind of just show you guys how the build is for speed farming. As you can see though, pretty much just one-tapping everything. Ooh, one thing I forgot to mention is actually my boots. So on my boots, I have attacks reduce evades cooldown, and I think it's insanely good. If you look at my evade cooldown, I can literally just dodge perma, which is fantastic, because anytime that I attack enemies, I'm instantly proccing multiple tornadoes, right? Or the tornado is doing multiple instances of damage instantly, so I can just dodge around like a psycho. As if the build wasn't fast enough, I can literally just press tornado a couple times and just walk away. One thing I want to mention is that a lot of people think that Shred is faster than this build, and the reason that I think this build is actually faster than Shred is that it doesn't look like this is as fast, but the benefit of this build is you just pop tornadoes down and you walk away. As you're walking away, everything will kind of just die incidentally, because the tornadoes will actually just track everything. While with Shred, you kind of need to track down all the mobs. Shred does have like faster movement speed as opposed to like getting from pack to pack, right? Because you're literally teleporting to the packs. But you don't just like instantly one-shot the packs as you're walking by, which is something that Tornado is very good for, and it's why Tornado is such a fantastic like speed farming build. And as you can see, I'm very consistently doing well over 1 million damage per hit whenever I have my like Grizzly Rage fully stacked up. And I don't even have Grizzly Rage up there. Here, I'm getting poisoned a lot, so I'll just hit enemies a little bit and boom. As you can see, pretty much all of my hits are crits because this dungeon has a ton of enemies, so you can really take advantage of Earthen Might just proccing all the time. And yeah, there's not really a whole lot else to say. You kind of just walk around and right click. It's probably the easiest build to use. Oh, that was a 2.5 milli there. Probably the easiest build in the game to use, maybe outside of like Hammer the Ancients build. You literally just walk around and just spam like a psycho. Also, depending on like how much you're actually spamming and how much HP the mobs have, that'll also determine how consistent you are with the build. Because if mobs have more HP, then you're not instantly one-tapping them, right? I noticed that I actually clear dungeons slower if they are lower tier because I instantly one-tap everything, right? And you actually don't want to insta one-tap stuff, because if you're insta one-tapping, you don't have as much of a chance to actually proc your Earthen Might and stuff because this procs on hit. So if an enemy takes 5 hits of Tornado to die rather than just 1, then you'll have, 5 times a higher likelihood to actually proc stuff. When it comes to the bosses, usually, sometimes you can get a little bit unlucky in terms of procs because it's only just one guy, but a lot of the time, you just walk up here and then it should just like instantly scale, and yeah, the guy just dies. That's pretty much it for the gameplay. As you can see, the build is unbelievably strong for speed farming, and you can take it into even like way higher dungeons, and it's pretty impossible to die because you just have so much damage reduction and infinite healing and crazy damage. That's pretty much it for the video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later.